You're listening today to the Oxygen Thieves. I'm your host, Gary, and we have Mike and Paul with us today. Paul, why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Hey guys, my name is Paul. I'm a former police officer at a local police department. I worked in the Uniform Patrol Division and also specialized as a traffic safety officer. Today during the podcast, I'm going to be drinking Jameson Irish Whiskey Caskmates Stout Edition.
Go ahead, Mike.
Well, yes, I'm Mike. I am prior service active duty Army, combat medic, served as scouts, and today I have a vodka cranberry.
I'm Gary, and I was a active duty infantryman, 11 Bravo. I will be drinking later on today, Glenlivet, 14 years. So anyway, what we're going to be doing with this podcast is it'll be weekly coverage, and we're going to be talking about those personal experiences of the backgrounds that you've just heard about, including events and technology that relates to that. Let's get into something a little bit more interesting. Mike, you've got a story for us today. Why don't you go ahead and start sharing for us?
All right. Well, since I'm got a background as a medic, I can tell you a bit on the some of the basics about doing the medic. I'll tell you the like what we do for the medics. We have the annual basic thing that we do is called Table 8. All right, and Table 8 is our annual medic validation. So every year we do a test, a certification, Table 8, because it's 8 different certification things. So like the first thing would be like trauma assessment, then like airway management, doing the second, third is like IVs, then like your medical assessment, then your triage is for fifth, your sixth one's like CPR, and seventh is like OB-GYN, peds, and then your eighth one is your overall.
Now, do you have to pass every one of those?
Oh yeah, it's Table 8. You have to do the whole thing.
Okay. And what happens if you don't pass one?
You actually have to do it.
So they just make you do it again.
It is it's not an option. You're a combat medic, you're a healthcare specialist. This is a you're a combat medic. You're going to do this. This
So
is a
failure is not an option, I think is what Mike's saying.
correct.
So for those of you out there that are not part of a combat arms or even military in the general, when they say it's not an option, you will do it over and over repeatedly until you're successful. And that sounds like the case here with the Table 8 is that you're just going to keep moving in. And if you fail, you're just going to do that section over and over, right?
This is it's not just that. This is also a training thing for it's an annual skills certification and skills test too, and also an outreach thing for the big army to make sure that you are up to date on the current skill set too. Like there's the cool principles like what's currently going on, so you don't have like the old fogies that are like, well, back in the day we did it like this. Well, you got to keep up to date with the current stuff going on too. So you can't be like stuck in the mud or stuck in a route of like back in the day we did it like this, and well, you have to kind of evolve with the trends too. But it's also you got to make sure the new guys get up to speed with like, nah, man, crawl, walk, run, got to be up to speed. So there's hands-on training too with this. So basically what it is
so not just a classroom environment then is what you're telling me.
Oh, no. This is a to do this, it involves classroom and hands-on. So it's a written and skills test. So you have to actually demonstrate the skills to do it with mannequins and actual people. Like there's an IV test section. So you actually have to do an IV access. So you have to do an actual full running IV on an actual patient. So the other medic that's sitting beside you in the class, you have to put an IV in them, and then you get an IV in the class from the person beside you. So you better hope they're good and they figure it out, because it sucks. Like I hate getting IVs now as a medic. I hate getting IVs because of the trauma I got from getting stabbed so many times from other people.
Didn't they stop doing IVs for field medics?
No.
Who would they go for? What was that?
CLS.
Ah,
Only medics do IVs.
okay.
What is CLS?
Combat lifesaver. That's like the first aid people for everybody else.
So
Only
it's
the
like
medics.
lower level than a medic would be then.
Yes. Medic
Gotcha.
is an actual there's in the army, there's the actual like jobs. They're called MOS, like oh geez, I'm such a brain fart. I can't even remember MOS's occupational specialty. But I forget the M is. But anyways, it's such a brain fart. But anyways, medics, the combat medic, the healthcare specialist is a job and it's your task specifically. So that's your lane, that's your specialty, that's what you do. And so that's your field. That's your
And I do know, like you mentioned, the healthcare specialist has evolved into different things. You were a healthcare specialist, and so that you just got assigned as a combat medic essentially. So and we were talking about CLS in that regard. So I in infantry we had plenty of guys that had CLS training, and we even
yes, I taught
had
that class.
what's that?
I taught that class.
Ah, okay. See, that would make sense that the medics would teach in CLS class. We even had some additional higher level than CLS as well. We had a few sprinkled in the units as well. But anyway, so we were talking about some table 8 certification stuff. Um, we talked about how you had to pass everything. How does that correlate? Like you said, as an annual basis. Now, when is a lot of that done in like a PowerPoint setting, like a lot of military training, and then you go out to the field, or how does that translate?
Well, this is done over a week-long block of training. And generally it's done off-site from your normal unit. So you go to you go to a training center for it. Um, we go to the Mystic Center, which is the medical
Okay.
service training center. Want to say, however, however the acronym comes up, but it's glorious times because initially the training was done primarily by the unit, and then it would also be done by the resources was done handled by AMED, which is the army's the army medical department.
So it was underneath AMED is what you're telling me.
Yes,
The training itself was.
yes. The
Okay.
AMED oversees the dictates for stuff.
Paul, with some of the CLS training in that environment, did you have anything similar to that as a police officer where you would learn some very basic interactions to take care of patients before the next first responders could get there or anything like that?
No, I know that's really common in law enforcement, but our agency, and it definitely didn't happen in our police academy, and it did not happen at agency level. We didn't have any type of, not even like first aid training or CPR training was required for us. Uh, Ironically, we used to say our medical training was ABC, ambulance be coming, because that's the only thing that we really could do was call for an ambulance.
Interesting. So when you showed up to a scene, if somebody's having an issue that might need CPR, you weren't even trained in it. You're not certified. So hands
Yeah, and
off.
exactly. I don't know if that was from due to liability issues or not. You know, it's like once you start CPR or something like that, you and the agency are assuming liability at that standpoint. And so us was specifically just call an ambulance. That's basically what we were trained.
Seen that too. I've seen that with the deer in the headlights look from the officer when I was at a scene. There was an accident, and I was the first person at there, and I stopped. And then the police officer that showed up behind the first officer there was just deer in the headlights look with the dealing with the person there till the other people, the ambulance showed up.
That makes a lot more sense, though, that you mention it now, then, Paul, because I've a lot of what I've been led to believe, and I assume a lot of other people think, is because police are responding to these incidents, like you would expect every one of them to have at least a basic level of some kind of care. And in your case, you didn't, and so you weren't allowed to do anything.
Right. Yeah, we didn't have any training like that. I think where I worked, the fire department were all EMTs as well. So every firefighter was classified as an EMT. They were not a paramedic. They may have had paramedics, but they were generally classified as EMTs. So from a medical standpoint, those guys were usually the first ones on scene. They would respond anytime that a potential for a medical call would be definitely having fire on scene. The police's job, if you're responding to any type of scenario like that, would simply be securing the scene. So, whether you're going to a car wreck, you're securing the scene and making sure that things don't get worse. As far as
Sure.
any kind of medical assistance, however, that's going to be fire department and then EMS when they get there. Our fire units were a lot closer. The EMS was more based around the county system, whereas fire worked under our city. So we had more fire capability than we had EMS. So those guys were always there relatively quickly. Obviously, if it was something more severe, such as a shooting or something like that, then they're going to stand by and wait for us to again secure the scene. That's essentially what the police's responsibility would be in that particular instance.
And that's exactly how it should be.
Yeah, I think obviously if there's a very severe incident where an officer is shot or something like that, yeah, you're gonna kind of do what you have to do. Maybe create some type of tourniquet out of whatever that you might have. But as far as any type of training or equipment or anything, nothing was issued at all to the police where I worked.
Okay. Okay.
Just as myself being a medic, trying
Well,
to get
and
words
before we
right.
get too far, Paul
Please.
did mention that the firefighters are EMTs, but not paramedics. Now, as a combat medic, were you classified as a paramedic? Maybe not
No,
to the civilian side. No.
yep. Um, it was only EMT, and when I started, when I did it, it had just turned over into EMT. It just then become EMT. Previous to that, it wasn't even an EMT. Um, and even now, it's it's still only EMT. They don't have not it has not even gone to paramedic yet.
Interesting. Interesting.
I
Okay.
would ask, Mike, you did IVs and stuff like that, correct?
Yes,
And I know, at least where I'm from, EMTs were not certified or allowed to do that. So
correct.
it's kind of ironic that you would have more training and be
It
still
is.
classified as that.
It is. It's a hybrid. There's it's a hybrid it's hybrid in between. It's there's been push for it a lot for it to become to be a EMTM for the what the actual for the medics what they do, because it's not they're not quite trained up to paramedic, but they should be.
When you say EMTM, is that a special classification that's already existing, or a new one somebody's trying to push for?
That they're pushing for. There's no
Okay,
reason
so
what there's a lot of argument for is they should and the US military just needs to drop they need to drop out the hospital medics. They need to separate those from the combat medics because they use they use healthcare specialists and as a generic thing, and so that you can get assigned to the field units and to the hospital interchangeably. There's a lot of argument that they need to separate those because you can get assigned as a CNA, basically like a nurse assistant, and go like basically like one of the butt wipers at like an old folks home. You can get that job, or you can get a combat medic job interchangeably, and you can get assigned in between those every
now
so
isn't there
often.
a push in modern years to do that swap over, or is that just like an active thing that's ongoing to swap
It's
that into
it's
that?
it's a push. There's an argument for it, but it hasn't. There is a training thing that has come in a higher a skill an identifier That's a sergeant position. There is a paramedic thing that has come in as an identifier
Okay.
because there is paramedics. There is Army paramedic school. They do actually have it now and it's for the words the aviation one is paramedic.
Okay. When you're in a helicopter, you have to be a paramedic to do
The
that.
aviation one is a paramedic, and it's the senior line medic. The senior company one is now there's going to be one per company.
Do they have any different trainings than the table 8 that we were talking about?
No, they're going to, from what I have not, this was as I was leaving active duty, I remembered that they were they were shifting over towards it to where there was going to be one paramedic per company. The senior line medic was going to be a paramedic.
Per company?
Yes, the senior line
Okay.
medic was actually going to be a paramedic.
Okay. And a company and a line company is could be around 200 people or so. And that may have a variety of number of squads based on what their
Yeah,
jobs
but
are.
that's
So,
1 per 36 for the
okay.
medics. And that's with the scouts, and that's when they're rolling deep. Usually for the other people, it's only like only for like
And
just
there's a
20
lot of
people.
stuff going on in the news with all the incidents that are going on. As a combat medic, did you guys do any special escalation of force training in terms of were you guys doing anything specific for your job set, or how is that working for you?
What do you mean by specifically? What do you mean?
So when I say escalation of force, from my perspective as a infantryman, it's the steps you take in force use that leads into deadly force. Did you have any training like that as a combat medic?
Bullets are the best medicine.
I see.
So my patients, that's the thing I know is that's bullets are the best medicine. My patients stay alive longer if nobody's shooting at them. So there's that. That's part of the TC3, the Tactical Combat Casualty Care. That's part of the Table 8. Circling back to that, the methods that I've kind of glazed over is that bullets are the best medicine. So if nobody's shooting at my patients, are good. But for the escalation of force, basically, I'm a support. I'm a valuable support element. So I don't ever lead into anything. Um, I follow whatever the unit is doing, and everything is handed to me. So I follow instructions as given.
More often than not, you won't be in a scenario where escalation of force isn't being done by a line person, and you're the supporting guy to help get those guys
Well,
do their job.
I am. I've always been in like a unit that we are proactively doing stuff. So it's like you don't shoot at people unless they are actively shooting you, or like if somebody like they give us a card that says like, here are the things. It's like if they have a gun, you can shoot them, or if they are pointing a gun at you, you can shoot them, or there's like if they are wearing this uniform, you can shoot them. It's like so there's things like that. It's like if they're like
Yeah, so you're talking about rules of engagement there,
uh-huh.
where you in a wartime setting is a lot different than when you're policing, but in wartime you'll have rules of engagement. That means that you can proactively engage with deadly force for these set of conditions. Allows you to proactively do versus escalation of force, where you would bring yourself up from a lower less than lethal methods all the way up to a deadly force. This is in war, you have that you can proactively use deadly force with nothing else,
Well,
essentially.
we had I've had the less than lethal training with stuff with how to with detainee stuff with operations, but for the escalation of force, we did like the yes, I think I knew you're talking about with the with the warning, the
Right.
lasers, yes, with the like you at nighttime with like the green laser flash, then the like the warning shot, then the fire in front of them, and
Sure.
before you fire at them.
And it sounds like you didn't really focus a lot on that just because you had so many other elements out there doing it that you really hyper focused on your specific job and not necessarily um, engagement as much. Not that you didn't have the capability, it just was a less of a focus. Whereas with my job, I was an infantryman in a striker battalion. And so essentially what we did, we had to go through escalation of force regularly. Being in an Afghanistan environment, there's lots of individuals out there when you're deployed that may have never interacted with military before, or they don't understand what you're trying to get at or whatever. And you don't want to just go in, especially with our job. It wasn't to just go kill everybody in sight. That's you got a lot of civilians and they are non-combatants that aren't actively engaging. So our escalation of force, we did a lot of the training, and we even got additional methods added to us when we deployed, and that came in the form of lasers and mini flares. When I say lasers, I mean large lasers. We had dazzlers, is what we call them. Essentially, they're those giant green lasers that you can that are broad
Like about a
and
foot long, like these big giant
hmm
tubes. Like these
exactly.
giant big tubes.
And we called them dazzlers, essentially because if you shined them in the eyes of a car, somebody driving a car, they couldn't see anything, especially the dark it was outside. They couldn't see anything at all, hardly. Um, but we would dazzle with those as a early warning, like, hey, you're getting way too close to us, from if somebody was driving a car, or more than likely a moped. That's what most people, if they were driving something, it was a moped, or maybe a camel. They might be riding on a camel. So you dazzle them with the laser, and that's very attention getting.
What would that
Uh,
do to them, Gary?
it's attention getting because it doesn't necessarily do anything to you, but it makes you say, hey, look, there is somebody down here. It's shining a laser in your eyes. Who has lasers? The Americans. So
So you would just shine it at them and
yeah,
to just
yeah,
like get their attention, kind of thing.
They're
yeah. It's
like,
it's attention
they're like,
getter.
we
Okay.
see you.
Did you guys use the LRAD systems, or is that like something that's not actually used?
What's that again?
That's those sonic weapon type things where it's called a long range acoustic device.
No, we did not have any of those. I know the Army was considering them and may have deployed after I got
Oh,
out with
is
them,
that
but
the
that is
microwave
not.
on the
That's too
truck?
much. What's that?
Is that big microwave thing on top of the truck?
It's a
Yeah,
no, 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 no,
sort
no,
of, right? It's like a
no,
big
nope.
projection
You
thing.
guys are talking about two different things.
Oh, okay.
W- uh, Mike is talking about a system that you attach to the vehicles it's called the Chameleon, and essentially what it does is it puts a bubble of radio frequency around the vehicle that scrambles it all. So if somebody is trying to remote detonate something with a radio frequency, it won't get to the bomb. That's essentially what that is.
Yeah.
It feels like it's cooking your face if you sit
Oh,
next to
dude,
it.
it's terrifying. It's like, yeah,
Paul,
it's.
though, is
Oh
talking
yeah,
about a
he probably
weapon.
didn't even. He probably didn't even, never even knew about
Never even
those.
heard of it. But Paul's talking about the emitter that makes it feel like from a distance that your skin's turning on fire, and
Yeah,
it's
it
just
can.
sound.
It definitely can. And
Makes
it's
it
very,
feel that way.
yeah, it's very directional too. But it can also
Yeah,
just be used for like super loud announcements and other actual sound stuff.
right. Basically a large piece of sound equipment that can really ramp up the amount of energy in it.
Yeah, I remember hearing about that years ago, and I wasn't sure if that was actually ever effectively used by the military for anything.
Yeah, it's really not. We didn't have anything like that, and that was way too slow of a method anyway for a lot of the stuff we did. We did have the lasers, but you're talking from pretty far out. You'd go laser. Oftentimes, if they were close enough, it would escalate very quickly on our side on the force use. Because since we were interacting with civilians so much, one of the first methods that we had was a mini flare, and essentially, you think of a mini flare as maybe something you throw on the side of the road. That's not necessarily the case here. Our flares in the military were shoot in the air flares. So they would go really high in the air, and you could see bright light. And you can see, there's a wide variety of them, colors, etc. But the MIDI flare was essentially like you'd load it, and then you'd pull a spring back, and it would release and fire the cap out, and it would shoot a little flare out, almost like a little firework, essentially. But it was technically a flare. I don't know. I can't remember what colors they were or anything like that. But we'd shoot them at the people or vehicles, specifically vehicles, to get their attention as well.
We had purple, green, and white was most of the ones we had.
Okay. Of the mini flares?
Because the ones I had were like the purple, green, and white, and they were like these little tubes, like, and they were like, I don't know, like little sticks. They look like road flares about that length.
That's
And
the
then like
regular ones. Yeah.
then you take the end off you take the cap off the end, you put it on the other end because it had like a little primer, and you'd like smack it with your hand with the palm, the palm of your
Yeah.
hand,
Those are the
and it
regular
would
sized
shoot
ones for
up and
sure.
then like do like these little three little things, three little bursts come up out of the top of it. It's cool. It's cool. I totally set one of the I totally set somebody's little kitchen on fire accidentally on one time.
A
Little
kitchen?
Yeah, like one of the little roadside stands.
Oh, that's terrible.
My bad.
But anyway, we were talking about escalation of force, and that was one of our methods. But the mini flares were like little handheld ones that had a self-activating, and they were very small. We were talking only maybe 5 to 6 inches tops for these little mini ones, and those we could shoot at people because they would only go so far. They weren't like a full-sized flare or anything. But then right after that, you're going into warning shot. And we shot them at the ground. We didn't shoot them up in the air. As soon as we're at a warning shot, there's potential. Like, there's no such thing in the police world because if you shoot the ground, there's ricochets, there's shrapnel that could go out and hit people and stuff like that. But we'd go right into warning shot, and then right after that, either disabling with vehicles potentially, or right into deadly force. And that was in like an everyday scenario. Those are the kinds of escalation of force techniques that we take, and that was because we interacted so much with civilians. And as soon as we got into an engagement, though, with or anything like that, if you were to get into an engagement, that goes out the window. Like, you're not going to bust in and shoot everybody up still, but you still have to make judgments and things like that when you're out there. But you don't start doing your escalation of force to everything, and you try to you go a lot of times you would go directly for disabling shots for vehicles if they're getting too close, because you never know if it's a bomb or even a warning shot at people if they're not listening, because you're gonna be screaming at them in their language to stop. Because we'd learned the basic fundamentals of that, so be screaming stop at them as well. So if they're not stopping, get right into warning shots really quick, and it could even escalate very quickly into a deadly shot because of how how much standoff you need for a bomb like that to go off and not kill or seriously hurt somebody is pretty far. Yeah, you can carry a lot of explosives on yourself or in a vehicle, much more so. You carry thousands of pounds there. And they'd even, interestingly enough, they would even up the suspension system so it would even look less suspicious by carrying thousands of pounds of a bomb. But that was from the military side, how we would do things. Paul, yeah, I'm sure you've had as a police officer escalation of force, because that's like a big thing in policing, even more so, like it's more known today than probably when you were a police officer in terms of the public. But
I would like to know more of his stuff because it's a lot more complex.
it is, because you have to be very careful because you're trying to assume citizen, it's not a wartime environment. You shouldn't be assuming you're getting shot at all the time. So how do things work on your end, Paul?
So, in my experience with the training, we called it the use of force continuum. So, we didn't really ever call it escalation of force, but the use of force continuum.
Yeah.
And if anybody wants to Google that, they can see the different steps. Basically, the way that you're taught and the way that the use of force model works is that on one side of the model, you have the subject action. On the other side, you have the officer's response. The officer is taught to always be one step above whatever the level of resistance is. So whatever subject resistance level is, you always want to be one step above that to control the situation. Obviously, deadly force would be the last option, and there's, depending on which model you look at, there's usually about 6 different levels. But that's something that we start learning early on. That's something like Police 101 at the academy. And then based on that particular model, you're taught how to respond to those particular levels.
So
And
when you're saying
yeah,
academy, you're saying that you're learning this escalation of force in the even before you're hired as a police officer in the fundamental training to even to get certified. You learn this.
Not
Is that
necessarily,
correct?
because
not
they can
necessarily.
work before they're hired.
Well, it depends on the
They,
state.
and they can
It
work before they go to the academy.
Yeah, it depends on the state. In some states, you have to go to an academy before you can basically even apply for a job. Other states, you get hired and then go to the academy after you're hired. So in some states, you can actually work for a specific amount of time as a police officer while training uh, before going to the academy. I do know that where I'm from, there were usually, if you were in a scenario like that, uh, depending on your agency, you're probably going to be with a training officer um, prior to going to the academy. I am aware of other agencies that would put you through your entire field training program and actually release you on your own before sending you to the academy. So those guys showed up and they'd already been through all of their field training
So in
and
some
had
states,
already had experience.
you're saying that a police officer could be hired into a department and then go through the department's personal training, get released to the to the streets, and allow them to do street work on their own
Yes.
before they get state certified.
Yes, and that whether that's still going on today, I
Yes.
don't know, but I assume it is. But also, that's taking into account full-time police officers. There's also reserve police officers who are much less regulated. So, in some states, if you're a reserve police officer, which would basically be the equivalent to a volunteer firefighter, um, so you're a volunteer police officer. You
So you don't get paid at all as a volunteer or a
I assume that
reserve.
would again that would kind of depend on the state. The
Okay.
ones that I'm aware of, no, you don't get paid anything. It's complete voluntary. But and then based on agency to agency, will kind of define what the strictness of that is. So in some states and some agencies, you could have someone that has very little training as a reserve officer who just has here's your gun and badge and your 40 hours of training and good luck. Now, is that very common? No, but it certainly does happen.
That's very interesting because you know, from my perspective, you know, I'm not from the inside looking out kind of deal. So I'm from the outside looking in, as a, you know, nowadays as a civilian, and I would expect it to be a little more regulated in a lot of places, that you would want people to have some kind of level of standardization training before you just release them to the wild. And I find that very interesting that there's states out there that say, hey, well, you guys can do your thing, and then they just need to be certified in this giant time section for the state.
Yeah, I think there maybe is a little bit of a misconception with the public in regards to how police officer training works in general, and it really varies from state to state. So some states you may have a central police academy where every officer from every agency has to go to one police academy. There are other states in which cities, counties, whoever will run their own police academy. So they don't ever actually have any state training necessarily. They're all done through a city specific academy. And that's probably what you would see in your larger cities, right? So LA, Chicago, New York, those kind of places that are large cities need a lot of police officers, and they just basically create their own academies. Other states don't allow you to do that. And then furthermore, other states do basically third party training where you're going to a police academy at like a local college. So it's more like maybe you're taking weekend classes to go to the police academy for
At the local
6
community
months.
college.
Yeah, at the local community college. And then at that point, you get your certification. And the standard that you see most often is post POST, post certification. But that doesn't make you a police officer until you actually get a job in that scenario. So, a lot of people in those states are required to go to those academies prior to getting hired. Now, I'm not familiar with what those procedures would be after they get hired because technically they've already gone to an academy. So once those guys get hired, they probably just go straight into field training or whatever the local agency can provide them. So I think the point is that law enforcement in general is very different jurisdiction to jurisdiction in regards to the actual training standards.
Right, and that would make sense from not only budgetary constraints across so many police state groups out there, that there's budgetary constraints you have, and then you have different state laws, different local laws, things like that that all play into that factor.
Right. And so, like
And
I said,
it's
I think the most common is post certification. So there are, I believe, states that where you can actually transfer. If you move from one state to another and you have post certification, you don't have to go through a lot of retraining efforts. Other states require you to get at least a basic certification process. So if you're coming from one state to another and you're already certified in that state and working in that state, and then you move, you may do a 4-week refresher course or something to get familiar with the laws of the new state that you're living in, but you're not going through a full academy. So it really does vary tremendously, though, among the different jurisdictions.
And that's from my outlook, even it's quite surprising. I'm always used to whenever you start to do something in a professional manner, it's you just train. You train a lot before you start. When once you start, you're continuing to train, and that's just as a infantryman, that's what makes sense from that perspective. But you can't. It's not realistic from a police perspective to have everybody's calling for years of training or a year or two like special forces or the Navy SEALs have. And it's just not realistic. There's so many police officers compared to those individual groups, and you need the personnel to get them on the field.
Well,
No, and I
it's
think you do get now. This is generally speaking, but I feel like, in my experience, the level of training that you get in the police world is pretty high level. I mean, you're talking, generally you're going to go to an academy that could be anywhere from 3 to 6 months, generally, and then you're going to be doing field training for probably another 3 to 6 months. And so I would say most police officers, and I am generalizing there, so I could be completely wrong in some places, but I would say oftentimes your standard police officer, once they are released on their own, probably already have about a year training in general. And then you would do continuing education and training, annual training, and maintain proper certifications on an
That
annual
makes a lot
basis.
of sense. That makes a lot of sense that you need that they give you that much training. And and like you said, there's probably variation, extremes on both ends. And when I referenced a lot of the like special forces and things like that, is they get that amount of training before they get assigned a unit.
Right,
And
right,
just
certainly.
like a police officer, they'd get the that initial training, and then they get assigned a unit and continue to train until they have an objective to accomplish,
that's
essentially.
yeah, but you can't use SF as a comparison. That's not even relevant.
Well, the reason I compare it that way is because that's a popular thing you see in um, civilians out there right now. They're trying to compare. They're trying to get the police to have more and more training, and they're relating it to our military's highest trained. And
That's
yet you can't
so
can't compare it, of course.
unrealistic.
But right, it's not a realistic accomplishment to compare the trainings. But the volume of training, the length makes a lot of sense because you're doing different things, obviously, but training your police officers for as long as you can feasibly budgetary wise and still make things work is probably the best action that I've
Well,
seen people
I
ask
would
about.
They're real
I
people.
would argue,
These
Gary,
SF are fucking bizarre weirdos.
I would argue that you're comparing two things that are not similar in respect to,
I can agree with
well,
you.
I don't mean the jobs in general, but you're comparing a basic entry level police officer to a specialized special forces type person. You need to be comparing apples to apples. You need to look at what's the Army basic training and your MOS training initially versus a basic police officer. Because if you look at the police world, there's all kinds of specialized training. You know,
I agree with you too.
You have SWAT
And
training, you have traffic enforcement type stuff that I
that
was
makes a
involved
lot of
in.
sense.
And so that's a like as a police officer, you kind of have to think of it as like, well, what's your basic infantryman getting training? And that's at that point that those are the two comparisons, and I don't think it's that much different as far as the amount of training.
You'd be surprised. There's there's a number of different entry levels, but a lot of what the Army does is they have the basic training, and then you got your job training, and that however that falls in based on your job may be different. Like mine was all lumped together. I had the same instructors the entire time, and I think mine was maybe 13 weeks, 14 weeks, something like
The
that.
basic police officer is going to have more
Yeah,
training than the basic infantryman.
absolutely. And it makes a lot of sense because a police officer, as a basic infantryman, the very newest of the new, your job is to do a few things and then just listen to everybody else tell you what to do. Whereas a police officer, you could be on
They're
your own. There's no circumstance where a brand new infantryman should ever be on his own. And that makes a lot of sense why the police officer would have more training.
a police officer is trained on independent thought.
That's correct.
That is,
That's
yeah, that's
correct.
a very, very good point.
Now we glazed over the you said it was the use of force continuum, or
Yes.
what'd you call it?
Yeah, that's correct. The use of force
Continuum.
continuum.
Yeah, I pulled it up. It's actually pretty cool.
So tell me a little bit more about that, Paul. In terms of you mentioned that there was a lot of training that it starts out from when you're in a all the way in the academy, and that continues on from there. And is that a
Yeah, so I think the basic understanding of the use of force model is created in your mind when you're in the academy, and then you're taught the basic responses and the techniques that you're supposed to use while you're in the academy. So, to really get into the weeds in regards to that, you know, the first few levels of the use of force model are really based on verbal confrontation and how to control a situation using verbal controls, essentially. So when you're training, you go through scenarios in which that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to control situations by talking to people, maybe directing them to do certain things. Um, Once you get into kind of the middle of the use of force model, you start really looking at your more hands-on techniques. So when you have people who are being resistant, whether that's passive or active, a passive resistant person would be maybe somebody that's just sitting on the ground, and you're trying to remove them from whatever situation. They're not actively fighting you, but they're not getting up. They're not responding to verbal commands. They're basically just kind of acting as dead weight. Somebody that would be an active resistant person would be more someone that is fighting you, but not to the point to where it's a serious fight. You know, they're maybe pulling away from you or you know, putting their hands up to try and prevent you from getting close to them. Someone that's actually doing something in a resistant manner.
now? To interject a bit
Yeah.
here, we see a lot of times that people talk about, or you can even see it in YouTube videos or or in articles out there where people are that you mentioned it was called passive resisting, and as an officer, you're trained to deal with that in a certain way. And how does because you see it so much, and people think it's a great idea to resist these officers in this way because you're not actually doing it, and they think that you can't do anything. Well, what's the reality there? What are you allowed to do if you're passively resisting when you are giving them verbal commands?
Well, at the point that someone's becoming resistant, it really depends on what you're trying to accomplish or what you're trying to get them to do. So, if they are being uh, passive resistant and you need to remove them. Let's say you have someone that's just sitting in a roadway, for instance. Obviously, they can't just stay in the roadway. That's not an acceptable place for them to be. So if you had some type of protest or something like that, that's all they're doing is sitting in the roadway, but they're refusing to get up. Then you would have to use a level of control. Probably at that point, um, probably that would probably move into some type of pressure point control tactics. Maybe not to that level. Those are more that you would probably use on active resistant people. So it could be using cooperative controls or something like that, where, yeah, you're going to probably have to start considering going hands on with this person if you want to remove them from the situation.
Okay. And so you mentioned that there was an active resistant, but you mentioned it also. There's a specificity there where they're not really trying to fight you, but it's just actively like pushing you away or something like that. There's a difference
Yeah.
there.
Yeah. So that's a great example, I think, is pushing away or doing something like that. If I think for me, the best example is if you're trying to arrest someone and you're trying to handcuff them, but they continually pull away from you. At that point, that would be considered an active resistant person. They're not passive anymore because they're pulling away from you, and they're actively trying to move away from you. Maybe they're trying to get away from you, or whatever the case is. But they're not actively punching you or doing something that's more of a violent assault.
Okay. And and so this use of force continuum, it steps up. You said you're always trying to provide the next level to control them from what they're doing, right?
Yeah,
So
that's how we were taught, right? So
okay.
you're as a police officer, you're going to generally be one level above what the subject is going to be, um, and again, all these things are used is to control the situation and to hopefully prevent an escalation of a situation to where it becomes a deadly confrontation.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And really, this ties well into a lot of current events. It's been a little bit now since we've heard of or and seen the events of the George Floyd incident. So, um, in regards to that, um, with a police escalation of force, is there any time that you would consider that a knee on the neck is appropriate, or do you think that that is uh, maybe a temporary measure or something that should never be used or it's common? How did that play into things for you?
Based on my training, I had a lot of questions, obviously, in that respect. I know that that is not any uh, observed training technique that I've ever come across, or the experts that I know have come across. There's no there's no training that you would ever get that would say, okay, put your knee on someone's neck. Um, Obviously, if you're in a life and death fight, you're going to do what you have to do to go home at night. But in this particular scenario, that obviously was not the case.
Right. Um, and I've heard there's other perspectives out there as well, and I've heard from a lot of people who follow MMA or even the fighters themselves have spoken out that a knee to the neck is an effective way to control somebody, but it's not a long term thing. It's very short term if you ever do it because it's a highly effective way to control somebody because it's so potentially damaging.
We were taught that in combatives. I was part of level 2 with the knee on the neck, as part of using the zip ties as, you use it as part of the you do have your knee on their neck, um, when you have grab their hand, you use it as part of the transition. You have when you have them on, basically they're on their belly, you have their knee on their neck, but you have it as part of the transition when you put the zip tie on their one hand, on their
So
one
it's a
wrist.
way to maintain control with your legs and use your hands for another purpose, like zip cuffing somebody.
While you're applying the zip tie, but it's a transition. It's not a
Okay.
pain.
Yeah. So, and to me, looking at it from a use of force continuum, you would have, looking at this particular scenario, you're looking at someone who the officers are using what would be called empty hand control. So they're not actually using any weapons at all, right? They're not using a baton. They don't have tasers at this point, and they're simply using empty hand control, which could, in that particular instance, would probably be I may be considered either. I'm not sure if it'll be soft empty hand techniques, which would be trying to control somebody, or hard empty hand techniques, which would kind of be like punching someone and using kicks. Now, what we were taught would be pressure point control tactics, which is like the number one probably taught way to combat people when using empty hand controls. And you are taught to use particular moves on the neck, but they are using, again, pressure point control tactics. So you're looking for pressure points, and you're taught specific pressure points in the neck. But at no point are you taught to put your knee on someone's neck,
Right.
Specifically someone who's already in handcuffs.
And now, when you say pressure points, that's a pain control technique, right? So you're trying to
So
cause
that would,
pain in a
that's
non-damaging way.
definitely a pain compliance.
Okay.
And you're taught a variety of different ways. And at least the academy that I went to, that was a very, very, very serious training, of which you had to show proficiency in each maneuver. And if you were unable to show proficiency, you were removed from the academy. So you were failed out. That's how serious that it was taken.
And that's a stark contrast to some of the training that I had. I was we never really had we had hands-on stuff, and we did train combatives just like Mike there mentioned. There's different levels of that, but we didn't take it so serious that an infantryman could be failed out and kicked out of an infantryman's job if he couldn't perform certain hands techniques very well. It was much more important on our side to be able to shoot and stuff like that, which makes sense. I mean, in a wartime environment, even if
Right.
we're not doing wartime duties predominantly, it makes sense that that's the way you treat it. And I was just kind of, the way you relate it, how serious it is. It's surprising that they don't take it a little more serious with the duties that infantrymen have had in the recent years. Because yes, infantrymen get into wartime environments, but they do essentially hearts and minds type of deal where you're trying to win the local population over to help you. And the way you do that is in more peaceful manners. And we just never didn't get into those techniques very much, unfortunately. Not to the degree it sounds like you did. Now, and you said that was an academy thing that you could get failed out and wouldn't get state certification for that?
That's correct. Now you could be recycled if the agency that sent you to the academy would want to recycle you into a next class, then you had the possibility of passing the second time through. But a lot of agencies, if you fell out one time, you're done.
Did when you had somebody fail out of the academy like that, if your particular agency didn't want to send you back, now, would that mean that you're going to get fired at that point?
Yes. Yeah. And yeah, and some people would try and go to, they'd apply for other agencies and then maybe get an opportunity to go back. But yeah, that if you fell out of the academy, you're done.
And that's even if you're in one of those states that you have this large brick of time. If you fail out and your agency doesn't want to send you back, you're done.
Right. So this type of thing, obviously, if you're going to paying for your own academy at a state that maybe that's the thing where you're going to the local community college. I'm not sure how that would work, but where I went, it was, yep, you fail and you're done. You're one and done.
Okay.
Best do it right.
Right. And we kind of we're moving into that knee on the neck maneuver, and we've kind of talked about it a bit.
I didn't actually watch the video. He already had handcuffs on when they were doing that,
That is correct.
Yeah,
and that's
he
just
had
sheer.
he had actually
That's just
already. Sorry, go ahead, Mike.
no. I'm sorry. Tell me about it.
He had actually already been in the police car. For some reason, they drug him out the other side of it, and
And as far
then
as I can tell, they have not. There were cameras on the chests of the officers. They just have not released that footage yet, as far as I can tell.
Oh,
yeah,
yeah.
I haven't.
That's just
I think from my perspective, the whole idea of whether it's pressure point control tactics or using some other type of use of force, the whole like idea of the concept is to gain compliance, right? Like to gain compliance. Like if I'm dealing with a subject who I'm going to have to use some type of force on, whether it's empty hand control techniques or a taser or OC spray, if I'm going to have to utilize something, the whole like reason I'm doing that is to get them in the handcuffs, get them in the car, and get them out of the scene.
OC spray. Can you elaborate? Is that a
OC spray is pepper spray for the just
for
the
layman's? Okay,
yeah,
so that's
it's
an
a pepper
additional
spray.
pain compliance technique.
Yes.
Okay.
yeah. But you still don't want
Yeah.
to do that in the car because then you have to deal with it.
Well, so um, is there any reason that you, when you were a police officer, Paul, would there be any reason that once you're have somebody in the cruiser in the back, all in the nice, would you ever take them out and put them on the ground? Like, is there reasons to do
That
that, or
They're
the
running their mouth stupid,
well,
and
no, it's not
they've
that.
hurt
It
your
doesn't.
ego.
It doesn't matter if they're running their mouth, Mike. The whole idea is to get them
No,
from the scene
that's
to
the
the
only
jail.
thing.
No, the something that there are two scenarios that I can think of in which that would make sense. One is if they and one of them it may or may not. The first one that may or may not would be if they're trying to harm themselves in the back seat. So if they're trying to slam their head against the window or against the cage or whatever, if they're trying to harm themselves, obviously if they're some kind of medical incident is occurring, you may want to take them out of the car, call an ambulance from that standpoint, or you may just want to divert to the hospital. Um, the biggest one that I could think of would be if they're trying to kick out the window. And so if you
Okay.
have like a normal window in the back seat of your police car, which a lot of them are, they don't have bars over the windows, a lot of them. Then you may want to stop. And I've definitely dealt with that where you've had someone kicking out the window and you stop. I don't remember dragging them out of the car. I remember putting them in a hobble. So basically,
Yeah. Okay.
if anyone knows what a
Right.
hobble is,
You cuffed their feet.
yeah, you're basically cuffing their feet, but using other not actual handcuffs because
Yeah,
you
they're
didn't.
larger with a
Yeah, but
longer chain
if you
between them.
didn't have access to that, I know some guys would carry um, dog leashes where you had a loop on one end and then you could just run the other end through it, so it became like a slip knot, and then you could tie their legs up so they couldn't move as you're transporting them. I saw that used quite often just because it was a
And I was just
simple,
going to
effective
ask,
technique.
you're talking about gaining control of their feet, not just their hands. Now, would
Right.
you ever, in the case of that scenario, like say they're trying to kick the back of the window out, so you pull them out, secure their feet. Would you ever secure their hands and their feet together in like a hog tie kind of thing? Would
Yeah,
you ever
we
do
had
that?
we had devices to do exactly that. But that was more often you're going to do that in the front, not the back, right? So our particular policy was handcuffs in the back, put them in the car, and seatbelt them in. Well, how are you going to seatbelt someone that's fighting you, right? Like you're gonna literally reach over them and then try to headbutt you while you're trying
Right.
to buckle them into the car. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. So those are the situations where you you're basically going to violate the department policy because are you going to put yourself in danger of this person by reaching across them to put a seatbelt on them? Well, no, but the department policy says they have to be seatbelted in. So you're either putting yourself in danger to get headbutted or get bit or spit on, um, or you're just going to say, okay, I'm not going to put the seatbelt on. Okay, but then now you violated policy. You're driving to the jail, and he starts kicking your window out. What do you do?
Okay. Now
So
that's
go ahead.
Now that's interesting that you mentioned that because in the videos that we have of the incident here, it's that they didn't spend a lot of time in the car. It was in one side, move around a little bit, and then out the other side. Essentially, is what happened. You got drug out the other side, put him on the
Right.
ground, and the knee to the neck went there pretty quick. And you're and the way you presented it is basically what you would do is if he was fighting or whatever, you may pull him out, try to gain compliance, and if they didn't have any way to do his feet, maybe they would stop the compliance there, get him back up, shove him in the vehicle. Is that kind of how things would work?
Yeah, yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, the again, the whole purpose is to gain compliance to get them on the road. Whether that means, you have to hobble their feet. Maybe they have some sort of hood that they can put over somebody's head if they're spitting and going crazy. Um, but my big question was, and I never really found the answer to this, is what were they waiting for, and in that particular situation.
There's no need to choke him out. Then, dude,
Well, not just that. No, my like,
they're an
what were
asp.
what were they?
Those things have been around for so long.
No,
I had one in 2008 for my first deployment. They're glorious.
I, sure, but my question, Gary, maybe you can answer it or not, is what were they waiting for? Because I don't really. Were they waiting on an ambulance? Like I just I didn't really understand what they were
I
doing.
don't think it started out that way. I don't know originally what they were waiting on. I know at some point they called for an ambulance, and when that was done is hard to tell without getting more information, like maybe some of the cameras on the individual officers. We might be able to get some of that information. When it actually happened, when did they call the medics, sorry, to come and take a look at him? And once you've done that, once you realize he might need some help, why continue? You know,
Right. I
why
totally
wait till the medic tells you to get off?
right. The because at that point he's not presenting any danger to anybody. Um, again, I I would my biggest question was what are you waiting for? Because especially in today's age, to go back to what I've said, the goal is to gain compliance, get him in the car, and get him out of there. Because what's going to happen when you're just sitting around, probably in an area, obviously with people who are recording you and becoming potentially more violent? To me, the longer that you're remaining on scene, the greater risk that this is going to escalate and more people are going to be involved and things are going to be even worse because things are going to turn violent. And
That
so
makes
and
sense.
for me, I like I've dealt with that personally where, you know, you're fighting with somebody. I want to get him in my car and get him out of here because I'm looking down the road and I'm seeing a group of people gathering up coming to fight me and get involved. Right. So it's like, I don't want to be here any longer than I have to be. So get him in the car and get out of there.
It almost, you mentioned that. It almost looks like that's kind of what the other officers were trying to do. Like, yes, he was the senior guy with his knee on the neck, so they didn't really do much. But the other officers were like trying to let him do whatever he wants to do, and keep the other people at bay. But the question remains: why are they just hanging out on the street?
Right. Because
Okay,
a crowd starts gathering, and now you're dealing with not just the guy on the ground, but you're dealing with a potential violent crowd.
right.
And like I said, I've been there. It's a terrible situation to be because you're always going to be outnumbered in that situation. And that, for me, why are you lingering around for 10 minutes? Just get the guy in the car and get him out of there. And that's why this whole situation, for me, the biggest thing that it just didn't make any sense.
Sure.
And I don't know,
I'm looking at
maybe
this. Why
they're
are they? Okay,
maybe they were waiting on maybe they had access to some type of van or something that they use to just chuck somebody in. But that wasn't something we had. You transport somebody to the jail in your car. So maybe that's what they were doing, but it still doesn't make a lot of sense when you have a police car right there. You can just put them in.
Sure, sure. And
I
what were you
don't
saying, Mike?
know. I don't know how police and stuff work, but from what I can see from how this is working, they're too much time on scene.
Right.
This
Well,
whole thing, why is everybody why look,
Paul makes a good point, and you bring
look,
up a good point too, Mike. And I've
why is
seen it in
everybody
my
so
training.
I'm looking at this guy. Look, he's sitting here. Why is I'm just watching, it's like this is not making sense. Why
Right. But you bring up a good point, both of you. Time on scene is important, and that's trained in relative depth in the infantry world, where it comes down to it's a different aspect, but in same vein, where when we hit objectives or do something like that, you don't want to be maintained there any longer than possible. In our case, it's for counter enemy action. And that kind of plays the same token. As a police officer, you're not maybe considering everybody an enemy, but there's potential threats. And you can kind of see that coming as a person. You see people gathering, that's not necessarily, that's a safety hazard that you need to consider. And the same thing with on the military side, we kind of see the same thing. We're seeing staying on the objectives too long. You can get attacked by the enemy again on their own in their own territory, or you can get indirect fire or anything like that. And I guess that plays like you mentioned in the police, where you could get a bunch of people together and they could try to beat you up or take your gun, try to shoot you, or who knows, right?
Yeah, because I mean, in these scenarios, you maybe are in neighborhoods where you're dealing with someone's brother, cousins, those kind of people who may all be people you deal with regularly, right? That are maybe regular problems for you, and so you end up in a scenario like that, and it's not good. Like you just don't want to linger any longer than absolutely possible.
Sure. We're talking a lot about this specific incident, but this has arisen into a greater thing that has evolved over the last few weeks here. And we went from protests, there was rioting that happened with it, and there's a lot of police interaction with these protests, especially in relation to the when people were actually rioting in those areas. Now, do from your perspective, Paul, did you ever do training that to deal with riots in any capacity whatsoever, or how did that?
We did from a very minimal aspect. It was not a significant amount of riot training, but yeah, from a control and technique type stuff, we definitely did a minimal amount of that.
So
Um,
there was a little bit done there, but there wasn't a lot, and I guess that plays into a lot of the makes sense why you see so many weird interactions with the police and and protesters. So if you don't have a lot of training in that aspect, of course you don't know what to do. So you're just gonna go back into other methods that you may do before, or you may even just invent your own on the spot as you're doing stuff because you've been out. If you've been doing 12-hour shifts every single day, or maybe you're doing more than that, maybe you're doing 18-hour shifts and only getting a few hours off and just cycling continuously. Of course, you're going to invent your own things if you don't have any ingrained training.
yeah, I've definitely been involved in riots, and uh, working those scenarios where you're working a 12-hour shift on the road, and then you're leaving your normal shift and you're going and working for another 6 to 8 hours on a specific event, and then you're going home and sleeping and you're coming right back to work and you're doing it all over again. Now, is that super common? I highly doubt it. But I've definitely been there, and I've definitely been involved in incidents that maybe you are outnumbered by 100 to 1 or 500 to 1. You have thousands of people and just a handful of police officers. Um, it's definitely not something that most people are prepared for, and it's an incident where you can easily become overwhelmed.
Sure. And do you think that plays into why you see a lot of some police aggression out there? They obviously it's everybody, there's so many people out there, there's so many things going on, you're going to see some negative interactions, but you see occasionally you'll see a video pop up where it's relatively peaceful, and then the a police officer may shield bash somebody as they're trying to clear an area. Now, is that do you think that why it plays into that more so than trying to be a little bit more peaceful when they're interacting is just because of the you're on so long and you have that lack of training? Do you think that?
That could play a part into it. To me, that's a really probably deep, in-depth conversation that we would have to have and diving deep into a lot of different areas, whether it's focusing on hiring processes. Um, maybe those people shouldn't be police officers, the ones that you're talking about. Maybe they had a bad day. Like I think I think where a lot of people go wrong is that they forget that police officers are humans too. Maybe that guy came to work that day and had an argument with his wife or girlfriend before he left for work. And he just is in a bad mindset. There's a lot of issues that certainly go on, but I think that police are human too, and they can get a mentality that it's us versus them, right? Where you made mention of earlier, somewhat, that you don't necessarily see everybody as the bad guy. Well, I would argue that a lot of your officers do. The only good guys are cops, and that's a mentality that is developed over years of interactions with the bad people. Because as a police officer, you don't really have a lot of positive interactions. You're dealing with a lot of negativity every single day. And so when all you do is deal with the bad guys, it kind of feels like, well, everybody must be a bad guy, but the only good guys are the cops. And that mentality to me also goes in the can go into account for what you're talking about.
You see the same thing in the military where they hoop you up and try to get you to train together really hard and be a unit as one because the enemy's the enemy and they're always bad. They're this and that. And so you end up when you deploy, unless you come in with unless you really rein them back, people you get crazy interactions with the locals in wartime. And a good example of that was we reined everybody back early on in our deployment because we were doing a lot of civil interaction as well, so you had to be much more mindful of your interactions in the area we're doing because we're really trying to build a relationship with those people. We weren't just trying to bully them all the time, even if our presence was essentially bullying them because we were scary and had scary stuff on us. But yeah, you end up with interactions like the Maywan massacres and stuff like that in the military side, where you see soldiers go off the deep end and treat civilians like animals, even though yeah, you may treat the enemy like animals when you're engaging them because you have to shoot to kill, things like that, and you may get that mindset, but you can't do it with the civilians, and you end up with these highly publicized events where we've had civilians murdered in a wartime setting, and I feel like that's an extreme example, but on the same token, you see that on the police side, like you mentioned, where you think that the police are good, so you assume the police are doing good, and the everybody else is a bad guy, essentially.
Yeah. And it's hard to detach yourself from that mentality, right? When you're going to work every day and you're dealing with the worst of the worst in society and you have very little positive interactions.
You think
Um,
you struggled with that a little bit as
oh,
well?
I definitely did. I know I wouldn't say everyone, but a vast majority did. And if you didn't, then you were probably one of the very few. And I think part of that is just due to what policing has become, and trying to maybe change that to create some type of community interaction that's positive. I know we tried to do that. I had friends that would go above and beyond in that regard, but I still know they struggled because again, every single day you're dealing with the bad guys, and I say that in the respect of, you know, you're going to a call for a guy that's beating his girlfriend, and then you get there, and the guy's mad at you because you're there. The girl's mad at you most of the time because you're there, And then if they have kids, they're mad at you because you're getting ready to arrest their, dad.
So
So
even if the woman called on you, she's still mad that you're there.
yes, and I mean, oftentimes it's not her calling.
Oh, really?
But
Like the
yeah, I mean, if you
neighbors?
have, a neighbor or somebody that's calling, but even if I mean, maybe they do call, and now, okay, well, I have to arrest him, but no, they don't want that. And so you're the bad guy in that situation. And you're dealing with people. You're not only dealing with what would generally be considered bad people, criminals, right? The bad guys. But you are every day looked at as the bad guy to them as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you may be called to a scene where everybody in the household looks at you as like the bad guy every day of the year. And so when you show up, you're already the bad guy, even though you've had no interaction with them whatsoever.
Absolutely. I mean, it's common.
You're the
Uh,
authority figure. You're the villain.
yeah,
You're the bad
it's
guy.
common. Dealing with children. If you talk to a 5-year-old, they usually look at you as a good guy, and you can have a conversation with a 5-year-old, and they look up to you, and they're very friendly, and it's kind of nice. It's like, oh, someone thinks I'm the good guy. But if you go back 2 or 3 years later, and now that kid's 7 or 8 years old, now you're the bad guy because when he was 5 and he's trying to talk to you, mom or dad comes outside yelling at him, telling him to get away from the police. And so they are taught oftentimes that the police are the bad guys. And so again, so you're dealing with a community who looks at you as the bad guy oftentimes, and then your perspective is you're going into a community to deal with the bad guys. So everybody looks at each other as if you're the bad guy.
And that would make a lot of sense why we end up with the way the police interacts in a broad how it's so broad and wide reaching, why it ends up being that way. We lead to a good point there. But gentlemen, we got to wrap up here, so let's
I
get
do need to
ourselves
add
moving
one
along.
thing.
Go ahead.
One quick note on that. As much as it seems like it's very fractal and very negative, it is very, very good and very well done in the US how it is. Because in most of the other places in the world, it is nowhere near as well done and as positive as it is here.
It may be one of the best ways that things are done in the world. Um, I could probably get behind you on that, and I could say that there's always ways to improve across anything, and I think there's definitely ways to improve
Our
um,
system
a
is
number
not
of
good.
ways.
Our system is not good, and it has much needed improvement in it, but it is far, far from the bottom of the barrel. It is closer to the top than it is to the bottom.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Check us out on Twitter at Oxygen Podcast and look out for future social media editions on top of that. We'll be back next week for more into the police and military deaths.